Hi, how's everyone doing today? And I'm sure you're all answering. I just can't hear you, and I'm sure you're doing great. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about the technical issues that might be hurting search engine optimization. And I find that this is a really important topic because the people who are generally responsible for search engine optimization and marketing and product for an organization, those people tend not to be super technical because that's what the developers are for. But the developers often don't get looped into a lot of the marketing or SEO discussion, since that's sort of thought of as being part of marketing. But there's actually a lot of overlap and a lot of ways where one impacts the other. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the bigger issues to really think about. And when I started diving into this topic, of course, I realized that it was way too big for an hour. And so I was like, okay, that's cool. I'll just pick out the really top critical items. And even then I realized, well, digging into the details of each of these could be an hour on its own. So what I thought I would do is go through some of the bigger issues, particularly the ones that can be kind of tricky, sort of show what the impact really is and what you might want to think about. But what I've done is that on my blog, 9byblue.com, I've posted a post that has links to all of the resources. A lot of these slides have a link to, the details at the bottom of the slide, but I figured that might be kind of difficult for everyone to sort of scramble and write down. So I've just posted all the links from the slides as well as a bunch of other links that aren't on the slides but are additional resources, so you can get them there. Like, for instance, we're going to talk about redirects. But there's a bunch of different ways that you would implement them, say if you're using the Microsoft stack, depending on, what version of IIS you're using, or if you're doing it through ASP.NET or whatever. And so the blog post has links to, the modules that you might install or the code that you might use. So just keep that in mind as we go through. All right, so we're just going to go through some of the top issues. I wanted to first show an example of how sometimes things that are very simple can make a huge amount of difference in search, and then we'll dive into more complicated ones. But this is one of my favorite examples, and that is, so if you've heard before, you may have seen me talk about other parts of this example. We're just going to dive into one here. And this is Richard Branson's Moroccan Resort. And I found this based on actual research I was doing last year when I was looking to go to Morocco. And so the reason I think that this is an interesting example is that, for one thing, the website is beautiful, right? It's very pretty, and so it looks great from that perspective. And then the next thing that you notice about it is that because it's so high profile and that it's Richard Branson, there was a lot of PR that was done around the launch, and so there are a lot of links to it. And so you hear a lot with SEO and search engine optimization, how links are important. You want to get a lot of links, but that is obviously not the only thing that's important. And so you can see that example here. So when I do a search on Google for Moroccan resort, I think is what I've done there, you can see, first of all, the website doesn't come up at all. And all of those results that I've circled are articles that are talking about the resort and linking to the resort, right? So in this case, like I said, he's gotten a lot of PR, and in fact, those are the sites that are ranking. And so why is it that, the site itself isn't ranking? What might be going on? So if you dig in a little bit and you do a search more specifically for the name of the resort, for instance, what you find is that it does come up, but if you look at the details, like the second result I'm showing here, there's no description underneath the title. The first one, there is a description, but it's not a good description. It's just sort of the menu. And the title, of course, doesn't say Morocco or resort or anything in it. And so if we just look at the page, if you turn off images and JavaScript, this is what you see, right? And so this is what the search engine sees. All they see, that entire site is just one big image, and there's an alt attribute on the image that just says Cosbot Automato homepage. And so from a search engine perspective, that's all they see. Now, this is a really simple one, and a lot of people are like, well, yeah, of course, you shouldn't have your entire homepage be an image, and, you should make sure that your alt attribute has more descriptive information. But, I think it's just a really obvious example of how you can have the best content in the world, but depending on how the technical infrastructure of our site is implemented, it could not show up at all. So we're going to talk about a lot more complicated situations, and I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for questions at the end because, we're going through some of the big stuff, but the specific issues that you have, may not be things that we're going to cover. So just for some context, I wanted to talk a little bit about how search engines crawl and index the web because this really provides, I think, a little bit of a backdrop as to why some of these technical infrastructure pieces become so important. So just at a super high level, this is my very talented graphic skills. You can see that I really should have been an artist. This is like the best I can do with PowerPoint drawing skills. But basically, right, when you're looking at crawling, which is, obviously the first thing, you can't ever get your stuff to show up for people searching if your site doesn't get crawled. So there's a bunch of ways that search engines discover the pages, that the pages exist at all. And so, the top three ways, of course, one is links from within your own site. So, the search engines are going to crawl your site, extract all of the links from your site. And then, of course, there's links from other sites. So, when they see that, they're going to add that. And then anything you've submitted via an XML sitemap, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, but a lot of you probably are familiar with XML sitemaps. So there's other ways, but, these are kind of the three main ways. And so what happens, and some people don't realize that, is that search engines they crawl your home page and then see the links and then crawl those links and crawl in further and then crawl in further. They don't really crawl that way. They just crawl one page and add to it any links that they have, and they basically just compile all of the pages. And then there's a process where they dedupe, right, because they might find a page through multiple ways. And so they end up with this consolidated list of pages that are on your site. And then when they go to crawl your site, they only have a certain allotment of how much that they're going to crawl, and this is based on a number of factors, right? The page rank value of the site, how often the site is updated, if it's a news site versus a more static site, the server response, right? And so how much they think they can crawl your server without causing it to topple over. So there's all these things that go into how much they're going to crawl at any time that they come. So they just look at this list that they have, that they've prioritized based on how valuable they think each page is, and then they just go through the list until they run out of time. And so because of this process, a few things become really important. One is the obvious one, which is just the discoverability of pages. And so, for instance, if you have a dynamic site that uses a database where maybe someone filled out a form to get back a page, and so therefore there aren't any links on your site to that page, it may be less likely that your site will get fully crawled. And that's one of the things that an XML sitemap can help with is providing more comprehensive coverage. Another thing that becomes important is that you want the crawl to be really efficient. And so we're going to talk a bit about that. You don't want, when the bots are going through this prioritized list, you don't want them to crawl the same page, 1,000 times just because the URL is slightly different because of, optional parameters or session IDs or something. Because if that happens, they're going to, crawl the same page a bunch of times, and then they may never get to the rest of the list. So the more efficient that you can make the crawl, the more likely it is that the crawl is more comprehensive, and every additional page indexed, right, not only gets you more visibility, but particularly when you're looking at long tail type of traffic, that all really adds up. So, when you look at it this way, too, you can also see that some of the questions that people have that we're not really going to go into a lot of detail about here is things like people think, oh, well, the hierarchy is really important, right? You need a flat hierarchy because the search engine is going to start with the first, the domain, like everything in the root, and then they're going to crawl everything the first folder down. And that's not how it works at all, right? They look at each URL individually, no matter where it is in the hierarchy, and it's just sorted in this priority order. The prioritization, like I say, is less on the technical side, so we won't go into the details of it, but it is things like, is anyone linking to this page, or are you linking to it from a page that's really popular, those types of things. All right, so that's sort of how things go on the crawling side. Then, of course, the indexing is really important as well, right? Because once a page gets crawled, the search engine needs to be able to extract all of that content and associated with the URL. So we'll just quickly go through. I'm trying to plan a trip to France, so you will find a lot of examples. So they're going to look at the page, and they're going to say, okay, here's the boilerplate that's on the page. This is on every single page, so it's not necessarily something that we should associate as relevance for this page in particular, right? And so here you can see there's like a header, there's a menu, so they're going to see that stuff, but they're going to realize that it's not specific to this page, but it's boilerplate for the site. Then they're going to see, okay, here are the ads. So again, they're not going to count that as part of the site, but they are going to look at that in terms of, for instance, is it only ads above the fold, or is there any content? So ad placement can become pretty important. Then they're going to look at the title tag, right? That's going to be one of the bigger things that are looked at in terms of relevance, and of course it also is what shows up in the search result for searchers, so it's super important. All right, then what also can be really important is the breadcrumb, right? That first of all helps the search engines figure out the structure of your site and figure out the structure of this page as it relates to the rest of the site, and it also provides links back to those other sections. And of course it also can show up in search results instead of a URL, so that can increase usability. Next thing, right, is the H1. The heading tag. So in this case, you can see I've highlighted the code. Some sites don't use an H1 because they're using some kind of CSS styling, but if you can use an H1, that is a little bit more of a signal to Google that this is really what this page is about. And for Bing as well. Most of the things that we're going to talk about are similar for Google and Bing. I'm going to point out the cases when they're different, but for most cases they're the same. Then, of course, you have the content, which is the bulk of where the relevance is going to come from. And, this is, of course, where you want to make sure that you're using the same language as the searcher so that you're showing up for the right stuff. Then we've got this image here, right? And so in this case, some of the things that the search engines are going to pull out for relevance is the file name, the alt attribute. And I only show this here not to really talk about images in particular, but just, anything on that page that's not text, the search engines can't really see. So whether it's a video or some other type of thing, you have to think about, if this is really the bulk of the page, how can I let the search engines know what this is about? So, you can see the examples here. The fact that they've used the keywords in the file name, is going to be really helpful in this case. And in fact, I think I may have found this page through an image search, which obviously that's going to be really helpful. And then the last thing I'll point out is just links within the page, so not the boilerplate links, but links within the body, that are very related to the content, because that's just going to help that overall link structure and get all of those pages crawled. All right, so then we come to ranking, which, we're not going to super get into. The key thing of ranking is having great content that people really love and that people link to a lot, that really answers their questions. That really is the key. But here, how is that sort of formulated. Here I've just listed a bunch of stuff. This clearly isn't everything. There's over 200 ranking factors. But you can start to see that technical stuff starts to come into play, right? So for instance, location. We're not going to go into this, but the location of the server can make a difference in terms of the country, right? If you don't have the TLD of a country, for instance, then the search engines by default are going to figure out where the server's located and then try to serve that up. Looking at things like authorship authority, there's this rel author markup, right, that sort of helps establish authorship across the web. Brand authority, URL duplication. So let's kind of dive into some of the things that from a technical standpoint you can control. All right. Biggest thing is blocking access to pages, and this seems really obvious, but I just wanted to show some examples that I have seen and worked with that tend to cause problems beyond the obvious. So one, of course, is just, you're working on a staging server and you push the code out live and you forget to unblock the site. This happens all the time. I see it all the time, so of course this is just something that should be part of your launch review. Another big thing I see is that someone will put together a robots file that works really well for the www version of the site, and then just because of how the infrastructure is, that same robots file will be copied out to all the subdomains, and that can cause some unexpected behavior, right? And so I've seen things get accidentally blocked because of that. Another thing that I see is things blocked because of unexpected pattern matching. So you can do pattern matching in a robots file, but here I have an example of a site that's trying to block the parameter ID. Maybe that's their session ID or something. So they've put star ID, and that does in fact match this question mark ID equals 123, but accidentally it also matches /lids, which they didn't intend to do. So one way they might be able to fix this, you can see this second example that I have, is if you just add the equal sign after the ID, it's only going to match the first URL and not the second. Google Webmaster Tools has a feature that lets you try out your robots file, either your existing one or a new one that you want to use, and you can put in URLs to see what's blocked and allowed, so that can help. I see the same thing a lot with meta robots, where that's not removed after launch. The other big thing that I see is when the meta robots is inserted programmatically. Say, they're looking for a flag in the database for something, and somehow the database flag is set incorrectly. Another big thing that I've seen, and generally all this stuff you can see I've labeled it under good intentions, is Google has a URL removal tool. I believe Bing does too in their Webmaster tools. And so if you're a verified site owner, you can go in and request removal of a page from the index. And what I saw in this one case is I had a company email me and say, our homepage is dropped out of the index and we don't understand. We're losing all of our traffic. This is a big deal for us. And, I look at the robots file, it looks fine. What could possibly be going on? Finally, I took a look at the URL removal tool, and someone at the company had requested that URL be removed from the index. They were trying to fix a duplication problem where they were like, oh, our homepage can be found through, the index.aspx or whatever version 2. And so they thought that they were doing the right thing, but actually they caused, the homepage to be completely missing. So that's something to check. And then, of course, just the last thing is if all your content is behind a login, then obviously that stuff is not going to get indexed. And one thing that we're not going to go through, but if this is you, you can look into Google's First Click Free program, which does let you put subscription-based content into the index as long as you let Google searchers see the content. And I don't think Bing has something similar. All right, so you've made sure that things aren't blocked in a weird way. And now you want to make sure that the content is discoverable. Just some quick things here. Here's an example from All Recipes. They've got these drop-down menus that I've highlighted here, but they're done via CSS instead of JavaScript. right? A lot of these menus are done in JavaScript, and if you turn JavaScript off, often the drop-downs don't show up at all, or there could be a case where the links show up, but they're not actually unclickable. So we're going to talk about this a few times, but basically, anything that you can do that's a progressive enhancement type thing where a browser with JavaScript off, and this could apply to mobile devices and screen readers and things too, that's really going to help the bots. And one thing that you can do is check the cache version of the page, so just enter a cache and then colon, and then the URL without a space after the colon into Google. And then make sure you click the text version link there, and you can see. So you can see in this case, the cache does show all the same links as the drop-down, so you can be sure that that stuff is crawlable. Another thing that can help from a programmatic standpoint is another really big boost in crawlability is that internal link structure where you've got those peer-related links. And so going back to our Rosé article, they do have some related links at the bottom of the page, but if you look at them, they're actually not related at all to the article that I was reading, right? And so if from a programmatic standpoint you can come up with links that are much more relevant and you get people clicking on them, those types of things, providing links that people really use are going to make a difference, whereas links that no one ever clicks on and no one ever sees are probably ignored by search engines as well. So here are some other articles as I was doing my research that I found on this site that are going to be much more relevant to the readers. But it takes a bit of code, right? And it's not an easy thing to get these more relevant links. But if you're able to do that from a technical perspective, it'll make a difference not only from an SEO perspective, but obviously from a usability perspective in terms of keeping people on the site. And then here's just another example with Ajax. The funny thing is that I wrote an article about this like 3 years ago, and that link is in my blog post. But I checked it yesterday, and the same issue still exists. So Google still is not able to crawl this. And so this is an Ajax implementation of these drop-downs. So you can see that the word local and the word web, both of those sort of expand and collapse with Ajax. But if you look at Google's cache of the page, the only thing they know about this page is that it says loading. And so obviously those links aren't being useful from a search engine perspective. So I've just put a couple things in here. We won't really go through the details of making Ajax crawlable. Google did release their protocol for this, and Bing now supports it as well, which is that you have this headless browser that serves static versions of your pages, and then you use this hash bang. There's some pros and cons to it, obviously. I have some links on if you want to find out more, as well as other ways of doing it, if that's what you have. Another thing, right, is that your outside links, you want to link not just to your home page, but to specific pages. And here's an example that, again, isn't obviously a technology problem, but it turns out that it is. So I'm doing another webinar tomorrow. And so this is the press release that went out. And you can see that they're linking to the home page of the site where the webinars happen and not to the individual webinar page. But if you look, it's because that is how they do the webinars. Their home page is where the webinar is. They then move it to an archive, and you can see that I've linked to that. But the archive stuff is on a different site. So basically when they archive it, it goes to another platform. And so those pages don't exist until the webinar is complete. So when they do all the publicity for these webinars, they're not able to link directly into that permanent page where the content will reside. And so they're probably, it's going to be hard for them to get visibility of any of that stuff after the fact. Quickly, XML sitemaps, if you're not familiar with them, all the information is on sitemaps.org, and basically this is just an XML file where you can submit to Google and Bing all of the URLs on your site, and you should do this if you're not. And there's a bunch of optional attributes that you can include, and I would say don't worry about them. This loc field is where you put the URL, and that's the only one I would worry about. All these other optional entries, I wouldn't worry as much about them. I worked a bunch on sitemaps.org back in the day at Google. And so one great thing is that if you create a different sitemap for different categories of pages, and you can do this, for instance, based on the different templates, say, that your content management system generates, you can submit that to Google, and they'll keep track for you of how many URLs you submitted and how many URLs were indexed. And so you can start to see if there are indexing problems with a particular section of the site or a particular page type. And so I've just shown a quick example here. And then on the next page I've shown, we have reporting software at my company that we've built, and one of the things that we do is we track indexing over time of each sitemap so that we can see for each type of page if there are any specific issues. The next thing, of course, is errors where the search engines can't get to the pages, and we'll kind of breeze through this a bit. You can, of course, go to Google and Bing Webmaster tools to get reports of this data, and here I've shown this example of a DNS error, and down below there's some errors around, your server was slow to respond. I mean, you should absolutely be looking at your Google and Bing Webmaster tools reports weekly. Often people don't know these issues exist. Even stuff with the DNS, I'll talk to people and they'll say, hey, well, I wasn't notified. Like, I've got some kind of monitoring on my server, and I didn't get any of this information. So, oftentimes you can get insight you wouldn't ordinarily get. I worked with a site last week who was like, we lost a bunch of traffic. We don't know why. I went in and looked at their Google Webmaster tools, and the errors were just totally spiking, right? So as the bots were crawling more and more errors, those pages eventually drop out of the index, and you're going to lose your traffic. So definitely something to watch. Another place you can get a lot of this information are your server logs. I'll show a couple of examples. Again, the software that we have goes through server logs and pulls out some of that data. Here's just some more examples from Bing and Google. They track the errors over time. They give you the specific URL and what the error was, and in some cases they'll also show you, for instance, if it was a 404, what pages on the web were linking to that page. So here you can see an example of that. So here's an example of an error, redirect URL too long. So you can see I've scrubbed this a bit, but this URL is actually one URL. And Google tried to crawl it, said the redirect was too long, and if you've tried to follow it, it did a 302 redirect to a 404, which you can see I pulled in this page. It's now trying to pull up my mail client. So probably that page won't get indexed. Here's another thing to look at. This, again, is coming from Google Webmaster Tools. The third graph at the bottom is a spike in how long it takes to download a page. And you can see that what corresponds to those spikes at the bottom is the number of pages crawled. It has a dip. Right, and so, that again goes back to that crawl efficiency. I have a bunch of links in the blog post about server-side speed, right, and things that you can do to improve that so that you can get as many pages crawled as possible. Status codes are a big part of what I see. Again, seems easy, but ends up not being so easy, especially if you're on the Microsoft stack. Okay, 200 response code, great, right? It means the page exists, all is wonderful. Not such a great response code to return when pages don't exist. Where I see this most often is with custom error pages through IIS. I think 7.5 no longer has this problem. There's things that you can do if you're on an earlier version, and I have all those links in the blog post. But yeah, returning a 200 for a page that doesn't exist, again, just means that Google and Bing are going to crawl the wrong pages. All that stuff ends up in the index, and that's not what you want. 404, right, is great for pages that don't exist and that never existed. If you've moved pages, though, you want to use a 301, right? You don't want to 404 those pages. Also, I see this a lot as a response for server maintenance. For server maintenance, you want to return a 503 because that tells the search engine, hey, the server's temporarily down, so leave the content you already have indexed and then come back later to see if there's new content. If you return a 404, for instance, those pages might drop out of the index. If you return a 200, those pages might be replaced with the server maintenance text. So you definitely want to return a 503 in those cases. One question I get asked a lot about redirects is how long do I have to keep the redirect in place? And really, you should keep it in place forever because people, search engines, links on the web never forget. And you should generally do a 301 for redirects. 302s, of course, I see a lot, again, particularly on the Microsoft stack. And what happens with that, because that's a temporary redirect, so how a search engine interprets that is, all right, so you've temporarily moved the content, but this URL will exist again in the future. So the search engine will keep the original URL, index it with the contents of what it's being redirected to, and none of the page rank values are consolidated. There are times actually that you want that to happen, but it's not the most common use case. So just sort of keep that in mind. Here's a page I don't know what the right status code is for please return to our website during normal operating hours. I wouldn't do that one. All right, so here's just a few examples from some server log analysis. So you can see the first screenshot just lists each of the folders and then the number of pages returned with each response code. And then the second one, you can see the specific URLs that returned to 302, right? So this can help you just go through and go, oh, I probably need to change all those to 301s. Or whatever. Here's a weird example that, again, we found through our server log processing. And this was a case where if you looked at the home page and the robots file, Bing and Google were crawling them quite a bit. But in some instances, but not all, 302 would be returned or a 301 for the home page or the robots file. So, but it wasn't happening all the time. And so, there's a bunch of things that could be happening here. One is that, if you have a bunch of servers, in some kind of a round robin or something, maybe one of them was not set up right and was returning the wrong response code where all the other ones were. Another possibility is that there's something going on by IP, right, where only for certain IP addresses, because the bots use a range of IPs, a different response code is being returned. So your server logs are really the only place you can find this type of an issue generally, because if you just pull up the page yourself, it generally looks fine. And these are the types of things that may not be reported as a crawl error from the search engines. So these are some great things to check your logs for if you can. And here's just an example of what happens with a custom 404 page that actually returns a 200. And these are just search results. You can see, right, because the search engine got a 200 response, they're like, oh, right, this is a page I should index. And I love how these pages actually say 404 on them, but they're not actually a 404. And Google will report this. One of the crawl errors that they have, you can see here, I've kind of blacked out the URLs, but you can see there's two issues here. One, 404 like content, so that's the example that I just showed, right, where the page might say 404, but return to 200, and then the second is redirecting to an error page as opposed to returning one directly. All right, now I'm going to dig into some details of Discuss. So this is actually something that came up fairly recently. I'm an editor for a site called Search Engine Land that uses Discuss for its commenting indexing system. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. So here you can see here's a page, and here's the example. You see it's showing, a certain number of comments, and then you can click the load more, right, to see more. So someone asked, hey, it doesn't look like these comments are being indexed, and if you did a search, and here you can see I did it, for a string from one of the comments, you can see it's not showing up, right? So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that when JavaScript is disabled, the whole discuss commenting system shows up in a different way. It'll show a certain set of comments, and then instead of load more, there's a link to older comments. And you can see, looking at the cache version of the page, that is, in fact, what Google is indexing. See, they've got the comment there and then the link to older comments. And then if you start clicking that older comment, what happens is that complete article is replicated on every page with just a separate set of comments at the bottom. And you can see these links or these URLs lead to each page. So that's causing a few problems, right? One is that, because the comments are loaded with AJAX, they're not being seen. So we've already sort of talked about, if that's your primary issue, things that you can do. Another thing that we didn't really talk about specifically, but as part of that, is that search engines will drop everything after the hash and see all of those URLs as a single one, which is why things like the crawlable AJAX or hijacks can help solve that problem. But in this case, we've got two other problems. One is that there are near duplicate pages being created because they all repeat the article. And that's going to cause some problem from a search engine perspective. They don't want to index and rank, multiple variations of the same content. Your links might be spread amongst all the variations of pages, so that can cause some problems. And also, we've got this paginated content, and so we may need a way to paginate it. So next, I'm going to go through, try to go through quickly what to do about those two things. So canonicalization is this idea of what's the canonical version of the page, so the original source version, and then the non-canonical pages are the ones that should all be consolidated into that. So the reason you care about it, one, of course, is you want a more efficient crawl, and the other is that you want to consolidate all of the values, so all the links pointing to all the different versions and all the other, page rank values and different values you want to consolidate. So we're going to talk about the discuss example in a second of how that plays in, but at a higher level, there's different types of duplication and canonicalization problems. One is exact match stuff, and this is varied capitalization, should the URL have a trailing slash or not. I mean, these are all just the same exact page. Another is parameters, right? Maybe you have optional tracking codes, right? And in those cases, you need the separate URL, but you still want to canonicalize the pages. And then the other is this paginated result set, as we saw with the discuss example. So for those exact match things, again, you can often get this from your server logs. Here you can see an example of the top one is AZ lowercase and the next is AZ uppercase. It's the same, right? It's just that varied capitalization all returns a 200. In this case, you want to normalize the URLs probably to lowercase and redirect everything in. Again, the resources go through modules and stuff that you can plug in to do that. The last example you can see, one has a trailing slash, the other doesn't. Again, you want to redirect one to the other. Then you've got this optional stuff, right? Again, you can often get it in your server logs as well as from the search engine tools. And so you want to redirect whenever you can, but the search engines support this link attribute called canonical that you can put on all your pages that says, hey, even if you access this page with a parameter, it really should all be consolidated to this version. And so there's a bunch of resources on how to do that. One thing that you don't want to do, a little caveat, is you don't want to programmatically insert the canonical value based on the URL because then you're just going to end up with more problems. So here's an example where in one example, the D in destinations is lowercase. In the second example, the D from destinations is uppercase. And what was happening is that URL was being inserted programmatically as the canonical value. So even though both of these pages are the same and they both have a canonical attribute, it's not really helping them because they're not pointing to the same page. So you do need a way to sort of programmatically figure out what should be the canonical and always writing that. In this case, of course, they would be better served with a rewrite or a redirect, but sometimes those can be difficult to do. Another mistake I've seen made is accidentally pointing all pages to the same canonical value. And here's an example of this. Again, this site submitted XML sitemaps for different page types so they could track the indexing over time of each type. The first table, you can see everything's fine. The second table, those pages went from being 90% indexed to being 0% indexed, right? And so because these were categorized in this way, we were able to tell exactly where the problem was. When we went and looked at those pages, every single page in that section had a canonical tag pointing to the landing page of the section. So basically all the other pages had dropped out of the index because they were flagged as non-canonical. So, it could be kind of tricky to use that tag. The last thing I'm going to talk about is pagination, and this is trickier than it seems, and so I have this really long article that goes into the details, but this will go back to our discuss example. So we've got these pages from that search engine land article, and so we've got pages 1, 2, 3, and 4. Great. So what you do is you use this rel next and rel prev, which are attributes that already have existed, but now Google's using them for pagination. Bing, unfortunately, does not. But all you do, right, is you just point page 1 points to page 2, and the other pages point to the previous page and the next page. So it seems pretty straightforward. Works pretty well. One thing that you want to do as well is add the canonical tag, and you want the canonical to be for that page, right? One mistake people make is they'll point all the pages to page 1, and you don't want to do that because the content of the other pages is not a subset of page 1. So the content either needs to be exactly the same or a subset in order to use that tag. So by doing this, you canonicalize each page, but then by using these pagination tags, Google will consolidate all of the pages into a single entity. And so all of the value signals for every page will be consolidated into a single page. And then Google will rank the page from that series that's most appropriate, and generally that's going to be page 1. If you have a view all version, and this is true whether it's like an article or, say, an e-commerce site, you can point you don't have to use the pagination tags at all. You can just point all those pages to the view all using a canonical. But it gets a little tricky. What if page 2 has an optional refer on it from Twitter? Well, these are the tags that you have, but since your second page is different, it breaks the pagination, right? Because page 1 is pointing to page 2. It's not pointing to page 2 with that optional tracking parameter. So the way to avoid this situation is to programmatically insert the value for rel, next, and prev. So what happens is you're programmatically inserting the canonical value and the rel, next, prev values. But for rel, next, prev, you're programmatically inserting whatever the URL is. And for the canonical, you're not programmatically inserting from the URL. You're programmatically inserting what the true value should be. So you just have to make sure that the code that you're using isn't the same for both, right? Because you'll run into this problem. We don't really have time to go through this other example, but basically the more complicated it gets, the more you really have to think this through. And I go through these options in a lot more detail in the article that I link to. But basically what you want to do, this is an REI example, and they've got all these like faceted parameters. You want to figure out what categories do you really care about. First, you want to do all the canonicalization questions. We'll kind of skip through this a little bit. But you want to figure out which of these facets would people search for separately, right? And so you want to create a separate paginated series for each of those and not worry about the rest. So in this example, I think the brand and like the gender are probably things like women's snowboards, arbor snowboards. You would want to be separate, but things like the length, the rating, you wouldn't want to have a separate series for each of those. So again, it's more complicated than it seems on the surface, but that article that I linked to goes into a lot more detail. And here's just an example of that, right? Women's snowboards for REI does bring up that subset content, but this long tail thing, 150 inches under $500, I mean, it's just not as high volume of a search. So we didn't get to a lot of things, and here are a bunch of them. So there is a lot more information on my blog post, but hopefully at least we've gone through a few of the issues and sort of why they might be important for search, and we even have time left over for questions.
Terrific webcast as usual, Vanessa. Thanks for that great information. We do have a lot of questions that have come in, as you can imagine. And again, folks, we'll let you know while Vanessa's with us, she'll answer as many questions as we have time for. Vanessa, are you able to see them in that Q&A tab?
If I clicked on the Q&A tab, I would, in fact, be able to see them. Okay. Yeah, so I can just get started here with these questions. All right. Is it wise to put each comment on its own page? I've seen some WordPress plugins that claim SEO value by putting each comment on its own page. Yeah, I would not do that at all. I think that actually, whenever possible, I would put all of the comments on the same page with the article. And what I would look at is, from a usability perspective, at what point does that start to bog down the page and make it slow to load? And at that point, I would go ahead and paginate by putting just the comments on, the second page of comments on a separate page, but not repeating the article, and then paginating those two. That's going to give you the most relevance and value on the article page itself. I don't really see any value in putting each comment on its own page, so I wouldn't do that. Matt Cutts asked Webmasters to allow Googlebot to crawl JavaScript files. Going forward, is that going to be a big problem to use JavaScript in site navigation? So there's a couple of things that are going on there. One is that some people will block their JavaScript files from crawling, and they do this because they think it makes the crawl more efficient. Google has said not to block access to JavaScript files. The Googlebot can execute some JavaScript, but they're not very good at it. And so the rule of thumb I always tell people is don't expect that it will be crawled and don't expect that it won't be crawled. So in other words, don't rely on it being crawled, but also don't use it to block things because it might be crawled. The thing with blocking JavaScript files is less about that and more about spam. So Matt Cutts at Google is head of the web spam team, and some spammers will do these sneaky JavaScript redirects and stuff, and then they'll hide the JavaScript code from bots so that they can't execute that and figure that out. And so basically what Matt is saying is you're not a spammer, so don't have your site fit the profile of a spammer where it might accidentally get flagged in some of the spam algorithms. So yeah, you should definitely let that stuff all be crawled. But like I say, just make sure that you have some kind of progressive enhancement implementation to ensure that any kind of text or whatever inside the JavaScript gets crawled. One of the links that I included in the blog post kind of goes through what Google can crawl from a JavaScript perspective. Bing can't crawl it at all. So it's kind of a bigger deal for that. Are there any indicators that visitors, crawls, bots, spiders to our site are misusing our data? Any way to ward that off as much as possible? Yeah, so this is getting to be more and more of a problem. The server log analysis reports that we have developed at our company, and you could do this yourself, is we grab the IP address and the user agent. The major search engines have made this reverse lookup available. So even though a bot presents itself, say, as Googlebot, it doesn't mean that it actually is Googlebot. So you can do this reverse lookup to make sure that it really is. So our software does this automatically. And like I say, you could probably write a script to do this as well. And so a page of our report shows then all of the bots that presented themselves as a search engine bot, but then actually weren't, and then it lists the IP. So, if you wanted, if it was a big deal, like they were scraping a lot of your content or overloading your server, you could ban that IP address or whatever. So that's one thing that you can do, at least. When you're speaking about indexation, you mentioned differences between Google and Bing. What differences were you alluding to? Yeah, so it is the big thing is around rich content, really. So JavaScript, Flash, that type of thing. Bing doesn't do as well as Google, although Google doesn't do great. For things like sitemaps, robots, and the canonical attribute, both Bing and Google support those, but Bing does not support pagination. Bing also does not support the canonical attribute across domains, only within a single one. For the most part, they treat links in a very similar way. Things are starting to diverge a little from a social perspective because Bing is using Facebook data and Google's using Google Plus data. And of course, if you log in to Facebook and look at a Bing search result and then log into Google and look at a Google result, you can see the types of social things that they're pulling in vary quite a bit, but both of them are doing it. Value of a heading structure after an H1. I don't really think things after an H1 are really a big deal. I mean, it's always a best practice to be semantic about it where you're using structure, but I don't know that the search engines really care all that much. Having ads above the fold, is that a bad idea? It is not a bad idea to have ads above the fold. Absolutely not. Totally fine. The issue becomes when the ads obscure the content and make it hard for people to get answers. Google earlier this year in January launched an algorithm update that specifically looks at ads above the fold. So if you have only ads above the fold and all the content is below, or if you've got so many ads that it's just hard to see the content, then it could get flagged by that algorithm. More and more, Google's ranking algorithms are trying to look at not just relevant content, but usability as well. So, like if the content is on the page, but it's hard for the user to find, then that might actually cause the site to rank lower, right? Because they're just trying to give people the best search experience possible. This is part of why page speed is important. If your site is so slow to load that people click a search result, click on your page, get tired of waiting, and then bounce back to the search result and click another result, that's going to be seen by Google as they had a poor experience on your site, and you might start to rank lower because of that as well. So page speed starts to become really important, particularly perceived page speed time as opposed to actual. How are they defining ads as ads? How different can your URL be not considered an ad? We have several properties on partner sites that would be nice to incorporate, but not if they be looked at as ads. Yeah, so they do a lot of things to figure out ads. I would say because they're always changing and refining and improving that over time, I would probably not ask how they do it, but I would just look at what it is. If it is an ad, then however you implement it, Google will eventually see it as an ad. So I would best look at it that way, like, is this a good place to put an ad, and are we putting too many ads? And then just not worry about the, can we implement it in a way where Google can't tell that it's an ad, because they will eventually. Which is better in indexing the site and search engines, breadcrumbs or sitemaps? So these are really different things, right? I think every site should submit an XML sitemap with all of their pages. It just really helps comprehensiveness. Breadcrumbs are great for usability, and they're great to help search engines figure out site structure. So if you can implement them, I think that they're great as well. I don't really think that it's an either or in that case. All right. And since I've powered through these, now I have one that will take a long time to answer. With an e-commerce site, what roadblocks can you eliminate if you do it right from the start instead of just throwing something up and having to go back and fix it? So this is a great question, particularly for e-commerce sites, because e-commerce sites have a lot of technical issues when it comes to crawlability and searchability, a lot of issues. And so if you can think these things through in advance, it is going to save you so much work. So some of the main things that you want to look at with e-commerce, one is, of course, canonicalization and pagination of URLs, right? Because you generally have these product search results where you have different sort orders and different filters, and so really sitting down and mapping out, what are really the category pages versus just plain search results? What is the taxonomy that we want? What types of searches are people going to do, like going back to the women's snowboard example? So you can really figure out what content you want to surface to search engines separately. Another really big thing with e-commerce is just that the content tends to all be aggregated from feeds, manufacturer feeds, and so there's not a lot of unique content. So since search engines don't want to show the searcher, the same result 10 times, you have this problem where you end up not only with a lot of duplication within the site just because of how the pages are dynamically generated, but it's the same content as other sites as well. And so anything you can think about from a value add perspective, right, because Google's looking at what is it that makes the site more valuable and more unique, right? So things like, can you show the trends over time of pricing? Can you show the most popular items, or, the best deal this week? Or, there tend to be things from a data perspective that over time you can aggregate, because you can't always write lots of unique content. I mean, if you can, that's great. Or if you can do something like Amazon, where they've managed to solicit a lot of user reviews and a lot of ratings, you want to think about those kinds of things. But it is a pretty big undertaking. And with that, thank you all very much.
Well, folks, that is all the time we have for questions today, and we would like to say a very big thank you to you, Vanessa, for an outstanding webcast presentation today, for sharing all your tips and knowledge with us. Folks, we thank all of you that attended today and hope you benefited from the webcast. We did push out in the group chat to you all the URL to access the blog post Vanessa was referencing. There's a lot of good resources there for you. As well, on your console in the upper left, there's a cover image of Vanessa's book. If you click on it, it will take you to go purchase it, because if you like what you heard today, and if you attended our webcast last week we had with her, wow, that book is going to get you a lot of good information there to help you with your website, so you need to get the book. Folks, also in the book, there is a checklist. All the technical stuff. So if you're into the technical aspects of your website, you need to get that book too, because there's that checklist in there, and that will definitely help you. Again, thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude today's webcast. Goodbye, everybody.